the sale of Alaska. In 1867, a historic deal unfolded between the Russian Empire and the United States that would forever alter the shape of North America, the sale of Alaska. On March 30th in Washington, D.C., Secretary of State William H. Seward signed a treaty with Russian Minister Edward de Steckel. The purchase price? Just $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents an acre. At the time, critics mocked it as Seward's folly, believing Alaska to be a frozen wasteland. But behind this unlikely transaction were deeper geopolitical shifts. Russia, financially drained and fearing it couldn't defend the distant colony against British expansion from nearby Canada, sought to offload the territory. Meanwhile, the United States, just emerging from the Civil War, saw strategic and commercial value in expanding its reach. Seward, a staunch expansionist, seized the opportunity. Despite congressional resistance and public ridicule, the Senate narrowly approved the treaty on April 9, 1867, and the formal transfer took place on October 18 in Sitka, Alaska. What many didn't realize then was that Alaska held vast natural wealth: gold, oil, timber, and fisheries. Decades later, the discovery of gold in the 1890s and oil in the 20th century would prove the deal to be one of the most profitable land purchases in history. Today, the sale of Alaska stands not as a folly, but as a visionary move that dramatically expanded America's resources, territory, and global influence. The fall of Constantinople. In the spring of 1453, the fate of an empire teetered on a single, fateful mistake. Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, a fortress city whose walls had withstood sieges for over 1,000 years. But on May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II's Ottoman forces finally breached its defenses. It wasn't just brute force that toppled this ancient stronghold, it was a single, overlooked gate. And that's not all. Inside the chaos of war, Byzantine defenders made a critical misstep. Amid the nighttime confusion of battle, a small postern gate, known as the Kirka Porta, was left open, possibly by retreating troops or by accident. Ottoman scouts spotted the gap and swiftly exploited it, flooding into the city before the defenders even realized what had happened. Nobody saw their next move coming. Once the Ottomans surged through the Kirka Porta, panic swept through Constantinople. Emperor Constantine XI fought bravely in the streets, but was eventually overwhelmed and killed. By dawn, the city was lost. The impenetrable walls had not fallen by siege towers or cannon fire, but by a door someone forgot to close. But the consequences reached far beyond that morning. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant power. It reshaped global trade, sent shockwaves through Christian Europe, and forced explorers westward, eventually ushering in the Age of Discovery. And yet, beneath centuries of war, religion, and politics, it all unraveled because of one forgotten gate. What if that door had stayed shut? Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history, the invasion of Russia. Over 600,000 troops of the Grand Armée crossed the Niemen River, seeking a swift victory against Tsar Alexander I. The goal: to force Russia back into the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain. But beneath this grand strategy lurked a fatal miscalculation, one that would cost an empire dearly. And it started with a simple, yet devastating, human error. Napoleon believed the campaign would be over in weeks. He assumed Russian forces would engage in a decisive battle near the border. But General Mikhail Barclay de Tolly had other plans. He kept retreating, burning crops and towns in his path. This scorched earth tactic stripped Napoleon's army of food and shelter, and yet, Napoleon pressed forward. What he didn't anticipate was how deeply the Russian army would draw him in, until it was too late. And nobody saw his next move coming. By the time Napoleon reached a smoldering Moscow in September, the city had been abandoned and set ablaze by the Russians themselves. With no peace offer in sight, winter approached. And here came the deadliest error. Napoleon hesitated. He waited 5 fatal weeks in the ruins of Moscow, hoping the Tsar would negotiate. But Tsar Alexander never blinked. And that's not all. When the Grand Armée finally retreated in October, it walked straight into the jaws of the Russian winter and relentless Cossack attacks. Only about 100,000 soldiers survived the retreat. Disease, starvation, frostbite, and guerrilla warfare decimated Napoleon's once invincible force. The invasion's failure shattered his aura of invincibility, galvanized his enemies, and turned the tide of the Napoleonic Wars. But one haunting question remains: how could the world's greatest military strategist overlook the oldest enemy of them all, Russian winter? Christopher Columbus mistakes the Americas for Asia. In 1492, Italian navigator Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain not to discover a new world, but to chart a faster route to Asia. Backed by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, Columbus crossed the Atlantic with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, believing he could reach the East Indies by heading west. But what he reached instead was the Caribbean. And yet, the most astonishing part? He never realized his colossal mistake. Convinced he'd arrived in Asia, Columbus referred to the native peoples as Indios, Indians, and spent months exploring what he thought were the outskirts of China and Japan. But his calculations were wildly off. Based on Ptolemaic geography and Marco Polo's writings, he underestimated the Earth's circumference by thousands of miles. Still, he insisted, despite unfamiliar flora, languages, and customs, that he was standing on Asian soil. And that's not all. This misjudgment would be repeated across 4 voyages. His stubbornness reshaped global history. Columbus returned to Spain a hero, reporting riches and promising gold. The Spanish crown ramped up expeditions. Colonization began, and within decades, the Americas were flooded with European settlers. But here's the twist. Columbus died in 1506, still believing he had found a new passage to Asia. He never knew the true scale of his error, or that his mistake would ignite centuries of conquest, resistance, and transformation. The Treaty of Versailles. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In the aftermath of World War I, on June 28, 1919, at the opulent Palace of Versailles near Paris, world leaders gathered to sign what they believed would secure lasting peace. The Treaty of Versailles. The ceremony was symbolic, marking exactly 5 years since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But behind the grandeur, a dangerous miscalculation was unfolding, one that would fester into an even deadlier global conflict. And that's not all. The Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the US, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy, clashed over what justice truly meant. Clemenceau demanded revenge. Wilson preached peace through his 14 points. But Germany, the defeated nation, had no seat at the table. Instead, they were handed a document that blamed them solely for the war, stripped them of territory, military strength, and slapped them with crushing reparations. The humiliation ran deep, and nobody saw what it would unleash next. Germany signed under protest, its economy soon in freefall, its citizens boiling with resentment. Wilson, who had envisioned a League of Nations to prevent future wars, watched as the US Senate refused to ratify the treaty. Meanwhile, German nationalists, including a little-known ex-soldier named Adolf Hitler, began to rise. The treaty didn't end the war. It planted the seeds of the next one. But the real question is, how could the world's most powerful leaders have been so blind? And what came from that blindness would shake the globe once again? It gave birth to World War II, letting Hitler become chancellor. On January 30th, 1933, in Berlin, Germany, in a move meant to tame a radical, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. It was a cold winter morning, but what followed would ignite a political firestorm no one could contain. The decision wasn't made in isolation. Conservative elites, led by Franz von Papen, believed they could control Hitler, using his popularity while keeping him in check. But they gravely underestimated him. And that's not all. Behind closed doors, the Weimar Republic was unraveling. Germany was crippled by the Great Depression, paralyzed by political infighting, and bleeding from the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi Party's rise had been meteoric. By 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. Still, Hitler had been denied power. Von Papen, desperate to regain political relevance, struck a deal. He'd support Hitler's chancellorship if he could serve as vice-chancellor, believing Hitler would be boxed in. But nobody saw his next action coming. Within weeks, Hitler began consolidating power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave him the perfect excuse to push through the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties. By March, the Enabling Act was passed, granting Hitler dictatorial powers. What began as a backroom political gamble quickly spiraled into a national nightmare. And yet, the true scope of the error was still unfolding. Germany's democracy was dismantled not in one stroke, but by 1,000 quiet steps, each made possible by a single miscalculation: the belief that Hitler could be managed. That fatal underestimation led to a world war and the deaths of over 70 million people. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The date was April 26, 1986 in Pripyat, Soviet Ukraine. It was just after 1:23 a.m. when reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. What was supposed to be a routine safety test turned catastrophic in mere seconds. Located near the town of Pripyat in Soviet Ukraine, the disaster became the deadliest nuclear accident in history. But this wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a chain reaction of human misjudgment. And the worst part? The men in charge saw it coming and kept going. The test was led by Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, a man described by colleagues as brilliant but dangerously overconfident. Engineers were ordered to disable safety systems and run the reactor at low power, violating protocols. Warnings were ignored. Indicators blared, and yet Dyatlov insisted. Proceed. When the final button was pushed to begin the test, it triggered a fatal design flaw in the RBMK reactor. Then, in a flash, a series of explosions ripped through the core, but that was only the beginning. Radioactive material, 400 times more than Hiroshima, spewed into the night sky. Firefighters arrived with no protective gear, unaware they were walking into a death zone. Dozens died from acute radiation within weeks, but Soviet authorities delayed evacuation, choosing secrecy over safety. For 36 hours, residents of Pripyat breathed in poison. Children played in radioactive dust. And yet, the Kremlin denied the scale of the horror. The international community only learned of the disaster when Swedish sensors picked up a radiation spike. Eventually, over 600,000 liquidators were deployed, many untrained, to contain the damage. The explosion released massive radioactive material, contaminating large parts of Europe and hastening the fall of the USSR. Thousands have since died or suffered severe illness. The Partition of India, August 1947, British India. After nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule, the subcontinent stood on the brink of freedom, but also, unknowingly, at the edge of catastrophe. What was supposed to be a triumph of independence instead became one of the bloodiest human-made disasters in history. It was called the Partition of India, and the line that divided one country into two, India and Pakistan, would fracture families, ignite violence, and displace over 14 million people. But how did it come to this? The answer lies in a series of rushed decisions, mounting tensions, and one man with a pen. It all began with Britain's exit plan. With World War II draining British resources, the empire was collapsing. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last viceroy, arrived in March 1947 with a mandate to transfer power quickly, too quickly. Religious tensions between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had already been simmering, But Mountbatten's expedited timeline gave little room for diplomacy or preparation. Still, the Congress Party, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, and the Muslim League, headed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, couldn't agree on a unified government. So the British offered a split, and nobody saw what would happen next. To draw the actual borders, Britain appointed Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never set foot in India, had no knowledge of its geography, culture, or politics. Given just 5 weeks to divide 175,000 square miles and decide the fate of millions, Radcliffe worked under extreme pressure and limited data. Villages were sliced in half. Train routes, irrigation systems, and farmlands were fractured. His boundary award was kept secret until 2 days after independence, fueling chaos. And that's not all. By the time people realized which country they now belonged to, mass violence had already erupted. As independence was celebrated on August 14th and 15th, 1947, mobs rampaged across Punjab and Bengal. Trains full of corpses crossed borders. Cities burned. Women were abducted, children orphaned, and entire communities erased. What was intended to be a peaceful transfer of power turned into a bloodbath. Gandhi fasted in protest. Nehru wept. Jinnah was left disillusioned with the state he had fought for. And yet the killing didn't stop. In the end, more than 1 million people died in just a few months. India and Pakistan were born, but at a staggering human cost. And as tensions still simmer between the two nations to this day, one has to wonder, was this avoidable? Or was it destined from the moment the map was drawn by strangers in a hurry? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Let us know what you think in the comments. Titanic collapse. April 14, 1912. In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, 400 nautical miles south of Newfoundland, the RMS Titanic, hailed as the most luxurious and unsinkable ship of its time, was slicing through the darkness at over 22 knots. It was the ship's maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, and its grandeur was eclipsed only by a fatal error, ignoring ice warnings. But this wasn't just a mistake. It was a chain reaction of overlooked signs, dismissed alerts, and misplaced confidence. And it all began hours before the iceberg struck. Throughout that day, 6 separate ice warnings were received from other ships in the area. One came from the Mesaba, warning of heavy pack ice and large icebergs directly in Titanic's path. The message was sent directly to the wireless room, but Jack Phillips, the senior Marconi operator, was overwhelmed with relaying passenger messages. He received the warning. He acknowledged the warning, but he never passed it to the bridge. And that's not all. Another ship, the Californian, only a few miles away, had stopped for the night after being surrounded by ice. Their warning was dismissed as non-essential. What happened next was irreversible. Captain Edward Smith, a seasoned White Star Line veteran, was well aware of the ice reports, yet he made no major course corrections and maintained full speed. Why? Pressure to make headlines. The Titanic had to arrive in New York ahead of schedule. Smith retired to his cabin at 9:20 p.m., unaware that by midnight he'd be awakened by a collision that would rewrite history. But nobody saw his next move coming. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout spotted the iceberg. Too late. The Titanic's rudder was too small for her size, and the ship scraped along the berg's side, tearing open compartments below the waterline. And still, confusion ruled. Lifeboats were launched half full, wireless calls went unanswered, and chaos unfolded on deck. And that's when another silent failure sealed the ship's fate. The Californian, which had stopped for the night just 10 miles away, saw Titanic's distress rockets, but didn't respond. Its wireless operator had gone to bed. If they had acted, over 1,500 lives might have been saved. But they didn't. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. And with it sank the illusion that human arrogance was invincible. This misfortune is ranked as deadliest maritime disasters ever. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. In the final days of World War II, between August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, first on Hiroshima, then on Nagasaki, forever altering the course of human history. The bombings killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. But behind the mushroom clouds lay not just military strategy, but a tangled web of rushed decisions, flawed intelligence, and a profound human error that nobody dared to question. The root of the catastrophe wasn't just the weapon, it was the unwavering belief that Japan would never surrender. President Harry Truman, new to office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was briefed on the Manhattan Project and its terrifying potential. Top scientists urged caution. General Dwight Eisenhower believed Japan was already on the verge of collapse. And yet, the US insisted on unconditional surrender, dismissing Japan's peace feelers because they included one condition: the emperor's survival. That caveat was deemed unacceptable. And that's not all. Unknown to many, Japan had been sending diplomatic signals through neutral countries, hoping to negotiate peace. But US intelligence either failed to interpret them properly, or worse, ignored them entirely. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, demanded total surrender or prompt and utter destruction. Japan, still clinging to its emperor, gave no formal reply. Meanwhile, the bombs were already en route, and nobody saw what came next. On August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man hit Nagasaki, though Nagasaki wasn't even the original target. That had been Kokura, spared only by cloud cover. Some US officials later admitted that the second bomb was dropped too quickly, before Japan could fully grasp the horror of the first. And yet, the war ended just 6 days later. Japan surrendered, and the emperor remained. But the real twist? Historians now argue that Japan might have surrendered even without the bombs, especially after the Soviet Union invaded from the north. But by then, the US had already made its point. The weapons worked. The message was sent to Japan and the world. The question that still haunts us is, was it truly necessary, or just irreversible human error on a global scale? The Rwandan Genocide. In 1994, over the course of just 100 days, nearly 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were slaughtered in Rwanda. The world watched in disbelief, but the one organization meant to stop it, the United Nations, stood frozen. This catastrophic failure to intervene, despite overwhelming warning signs, remains one of the most haunting chapters in modern diplomacy. And the truth is, the genocide wasn't sudden. It was foreseen and ignored. It began months before April 6, 1994, when Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, urgently warned of stockpiled weapons and plans for mass extermination. He pleaded for reinforcements. Just 5,000 troops, he said, could prevent catastrophe. But the UN headquarters, citing rules of engagement and political neutrality, refused. Worse still, US and Belgian officials lobbied against increased involvement, haunted by the recent disaster in Somalia. And that's not all. Just hours after the genocide began, Belgium pulled its troops, and the UN cut Dallaire's force to under 500 soldiers, in a country already on fire. As machetes tore through neighborhoods and mass graves overflowed, radio stations openly incited murder, calling Tutsi cockroaches to be exterminated. Dallaire begged again for intervention, for jamming equipment, for protection of civilians. The Security Council debated, delayed, and diluted. Powerful nations refused to use the word genocide, fearing legal obligation to act under the 1948 Genocide Convention. Nobody saw the next betrayal coming. France launched Operation Turquoise, but critics accused it of protecting the genocidal Hutu regime instead of saving lives. When the genocide finally ended in July 1994, it wasn't because the world acted. It was because the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a rebel group led by Paul Kagame, fought its way to victory. By then, hundreds of thousands were dead. The UN later admitted its failure. Dallaire, shattered and disillusioned, said he was asked to watch people die. And yet, the full weight of accountability remains elusive. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos here. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.